You could say that my story is a string of B's, and I explained that to children there and here as that letter between A and C, not the bumble, although I bumble a lot, and not the stinging kind, although over there you sting and get stung. But the first B for me was that I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. Sometimes in places like up here, and I say that, they offer me their condolences because Birmingham has historically been a very troubled city, right? Birmingham is where we put Martin Luther King Jr. in jail, for instance, and many of our white church leaders rationalized that. They really thought it was all right, and I remember coming along with that strange paradox, at least it seemed to me, strange translation of biblical truth, that didn't work. And somebody very wise said to me, because I'm a Christian, a serious Christian, look, you can't follow Jesus down a road he never took. And that sort of stuck with me ever since Birmingham, especially looking at conflicts and wondering, as the expression is these days, what would Jesus do? Martin, when he wasn't in jail in Birmingham, was very busy training children in the theory and practice of nonviolence. What is it? What is the history of it? How is it operated in the world? But how do you do it? And maybe most importantly, at least it seemed to me, how do you teach it? Please fast forward, children, to the next B. By the late 70s, this Southern Christian conservative woman from a pretty well-heeled family had met and fallen madly in love with, and still am, a Yankee liberal Jew in show business, or that's what my elegant mother called broadcast journalism, very scornfully. Jerry had been asked to run CNN's Washington Bureau, and I was testing my own vocation as an adult for the Episcopal ministry. I wanted to be an Episcopal priest. Very quickly, CNN wanted Jerry to go to Beirut. Now, many of you are too young to have any idea what I'm talking about. You weren't born then. I'm talking 20 years ago. But back then, Beirut is where the action was. The lead story. Beirut was in terrible conflict, terribly bloody conflict, for this reason. Israel had invaded Lebanon and driven all the way to the capital, killing civilians as they went. The Christian army, the phalange, and I say quote, quote, Christian, because under the mandate of the French when they left Lebanon, the president of Lebanon always had to be a Christian. That was set up that way. And so, of course, that wasn't very happy news for the majority who wanted a democracy, and the majority was Muslim. So the Christian army had slaughtered the Palestinian refugees in the camps there of Sabra and Shatila. I see a few nods. Some of you may remember. So let's look again. Israel invaded, killing civilians. Christian army wiping out refugees in the camp. Who am I leaving out? Oh, the Muslims having a bloody civil war because they didn't like the deal dealt them. And then on top of that, the battleship New Jersey, well, our battleship was out in the Mediterranean firing into Lebanon, killing civilians. Everybody was killing everybody else, and everybody thought they were right. Does that sound familiar? To top that all off, Jerry managed to get himself kidnapped and held hostage by Hezbollah, a Muslim extremist group. Today we would certainly say terrorist. In fact, we did back then. That's the first time I ever really heard the word in spades. And that's another story. That's the story of my book. Maybe you'll want to read it. I didn't know back then, though, that I was living right at the heart of a conflict that would drive both Eastern and Western worlds further and further into violence on all sides, more so than any other conflict in history. This ongoing fight now is the longest, by far the bloodiest, and I think the least understood of them all. And I make that last statement with great sadness, because after living and working there on the ground, as they say in television, I really don't see any progress toward resolution. And I see a lot of signs of violent escalation on all sides. So that Beirut was critical for me as a human being, trying to understand conflict and trying to understand a spiritual perspective on it. But it was also pivotal, quite pivotal, for the U.S. and for the whole Western world, who hardly watched that story unfolding 20 years ago, and it's still unfolding, isn't it? The hostages, and they were all held in the same house by the same people for the same reason, which they told our government quite clearly. The hostages became known as the forgotten American hostages because the media was mandated not to cover the story. Maybe some of you remember, but Jimmy Carter had really lost the White House because of hostages. And the candidate, Ronald Reagan, said Americans will never be held hostage again. Very soon they were, many more of them, and held infinitely longer. And so you can understand they wanted the story covered up. The only brave thing I have ever done, I'm sure, is I went public in due time. I went public and live, which I learned, don't tape, go live if you have something to say, live on American television and broadcast by satellite all over the world. I tried to explain the situation and the plight of all the hostages due to the root causes of the situation. In other words, to tell the truth. Because when, if he ever went on television, the president would say, we don't know anything about this. We don't know who they are or what they want. It is mindless, groundless terrorism. And then he would take me down to the State Department and show me the video of Jerry holding up the newspaper with the date on it, saying this is who they are, and this is what they want, and this is what it's about. And that was shocking, very shocking to me. After I went public, I lost about half of my friends and all of the support of the U.S. government. But the group that came forward to support me and are still friends are people very, very serious about finding the path to peace in the Middle East. And one of them is the most distinguished probably of the group, said, you're saying the right thing, you're doing the right thing. And he took me back to the Middle East and negotiated the conditions for Jerry's release. The conditions, I say, Jerry had to do his part, and that's the story. It's often compared to the same problem which Oliver North had. Ali and I had the same problem. We negotiated for Jerry non-violently. Ali, in full knowledge of that, went to Tehran with arms for the Ayatollah and the money for the Contras of Latin America. And maybe you remember Iran-Contra hostage scandal. And Ali was a convicted felon, and that was a great tragedy in American history. I still insist, if we talked out loud about it and looked at it more, the path of history since then could have been different, but we didn't. Dr. Bowling, who literally saved Jerry's life, was a famous Quaker and really a specialist on the Middle East, very involved in the negotiating of the peace process for years. We felt assured that we could get them all out, but as I said, the government, in full knowledge of that, chose a different path. And when that was obvious, the extremists picked up Terry Anderson to replace Jerry and held him for 7 years. That was the scandal. That was 2 ways to solve this kind of conflict. And sometimes we look back at it and study which is a better way. One last thing about that bee before we move rapidly on. I think I tried to make a deal with God. I said, if you'll just let me have him back, I won't ask you for anything else. You know how that goes. I'm sure we've all done that. And it gets to be, what have you done for me lately, really? But walking home one day in Beirut, I saw a little boy, probably 4 years old, in short pants, with a pacifier in his mouth and an AK-47 rifle across his lap. I've seen his twin many, many times since, in many places, and I think his picture is just engraved on my heart. So again, in my deal with God, I said, I better come out of seminary. I better come out of thumping the Bible and sermonizing to the people. The truth will set you free. I want to know how you teach nonviolence, because I think it's our only hope. Psychologists used to say, and I think they still do, conflict, certainly to a child, means one of 2 things: fight or flight. I know as a child, my grandma said, run, run, live to fight another day. We were never taught the alternatives, the third way, the way out nonviolently. And I think that's pretty measured. I think we weren't taught because we have to demonize the other side of our conflict if we're going to kill them. If we're going to fight, if we're not going to run away, if we're going to fight, we're going to have to really make enemies out of them. And that sort of sets aside the business of getting to know them and getting to the root cause of what we're conflicted about. So I think actually that's child abuse. I think our children deserve to be taught and to know this thing called resilience, this ability to look at conflict as an opportunity and to find the nonviolent ways out of it. So I went back to school and I did a master's and then a doctorate in this thing called peace education. How do you teach it? And does it really work? And how do you prove it works? How do you evaluate the program? How do you know you're getting somewhere? And they won't let you out of Columbia University in this field without one word clearly in your mind and in your heart and in whatever activity you choose. And that word is systemic. And systemic means pre-kindergarten all the way to graduate school. Every grade, every class, every teacher thoroughly trained with the best of the best material to learn nonviolence in conflict resolution. You see, we know a lot about waging war, and we know very little about preventing it, very little about building peace anywhere, especially at home. So, as I said, I went back to learn that. I was reaffirmed as I looked in the School of Education how to teach it, finally, by the medical world. Did you know that violence among children, especially in America, but all over the world, violence is our #1 health problem? More children are hurt by violence than by disease. Big time. And the doctors are reaffirming this and saying, look, we can sew them up in the emergency room, or we can provide counseling, which you can get if you can afford it, but that's after the fact. That's the traumatized child. If you're talking prevention, and we must, we're talking education in the schools systemically. Kindergarten. Now these are hard words. This means not just, although it's okay, not just a peace club here, not just a summer camp looking at peace, not just character building in the 2nd grade or all those programs which cost millions and millions of dollars. Not just taking Israeli and Palestinian children out to Cyprus and having them play soccer and saying, look, they get along. It doesn't hold up. It isn't sustainable. It doesn't change the system. Systems are changed systemically. And let's try and remember that together. In Bethlehem, my house is right on the military line where Israel has almost completely, and probably since I came home, finished the job of totally enclosing us in Bethlehem, that is, behind a 29-foot high, 6 feet thick concrete wall. That is how we live, inside the concrete wall. My Israeli colleagues, and I taught all last year in Israel, my Israeli colleagues cannot get in by law. We can't get out, but the children that I worked with and the youth and the older students have not been out. This is the 3rd generation. They have not been out in 3 generations. Most of them have never seen the villages that their grandparents came from when they were pushed into the refugee camps that are there in Bethlehem and other places. Most all my students have lost at least one member of their family to violence. But we're working together. We're looking at this thing under real pressure, real injustice, real deprivation. We're looking at this thing called peace education together. These children that you're looking at now on the little side of systemic are children in Bethlehem. They've all come together, kindergarten children and pre-K, on this occasion to talk about this very subject and to talk about why we want it. They ask me when I'm coming home, do Americans not know what's happening to us, or do they not care? And I don't know, so I ask you, do Americans not know what's happening to them? And in a very real sense, what's happening to the heart of Israel, who's perpetuating a lot of this? Do they not know what's happening? Because in a sense, they're all victims. Or do they not care? Or maybe even, do they not care to know? The little walled-in model in Bethlehem, where we're talking about all this behind the wall, has a number of schools, a number of kindergartens that we work with in the system. This one is an orphanage. These are all orphans in a system called SOS. I don't know if any of you know about SOS, but the SOS system for orphans was created after the Second World War, and they're very keen on nonviolence systemically. They live in villages, each house having 8 or 9 children with a carefully trained mama, and they have a very fine school in the heart of Bethlehem. In fact, it's so good that the families around in Bethlehem want their children in the orphanage school, which is fine with us because that mainstreams the orphans with children who still have families. This one is another kindergarten, actually a very poor kindergarten in Beit Sahur, which is Shepherd's Field, where the shepherds saw the star, and followed it to Bethlehem. These children have surprised us because they don't begin to teach English in the West Bank anyway till the 3rd or 4th grade. And these are 4-year-olds, and they're beginning to speak English. And a child will come up and say, they call me Dr. Seuss. I knew him too, he was wonderful. Dr. Seuss, I am building peace. What? I didn't know you spoke English. Well, we figured it out. In learning any language, but certainly in learning English, and they speak Hebrew and Arabic, in learning English, see Dick and Jane run is boring. I am building peace is motivational, and they're picking it up. And at the university level, they're excited about it. In other words, in teaching peace, we're discovering these side roads in education that are really a bonus, aren't they? These are my teenagers who come to us from all the high schools in Bethlehem. They insist that they're the pivotal ones because they're in the middle. They like to say, I'm middle-aged. And I say that doesn't translate. They won't get it. What they mean is they're right in the middle and they still understand the little ones, and they mentor them and they bring them along, especially with English. They're quite articulate in English. They also understand at the university level, so they are pivotal. We worry in education in America about teenagers a lot. The hormones are pumping, boys will be boys, and we have a lot of bullying at that age, and we worry. It's interesting. We need to plug into this and have them know each other better and talk. These children are very mature. There they are at my house, and this is a visiting delegation called FOR, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Maybe some of you know. Delegations come at least once a week, and they want to see how this is working. And they have very critical thinking conversations, especially with the teenagers. And usually, not always, but usually they will say, we know, just hold on, we know you're going to have your country someday. Be brave and be good, and you'll have your country someday. And then you can have a democracy like ours. And my teenagers say, but we don't want a democracy like yours. We want a true democracy where there are no second or third class citizens like in Israel. We want a true democracy that is nonviolent, that doesn't run off to war to solve their problems. And that's important, critical thinking. And it does us good to hear it, I think. These are teenagers who've just put on a play, a very sophisticated play. They're reading biographies, Anne Frank, that kind of thing, across the boards through history. They're writing their own biographies and then putting them into drama. That's okay. College level, university level. This happens to be because we were invited to do a seminar, the Arab American University at Jenin, which was quite a challenge because when we were invited, we had just had the massacre at Jenin. Perhaps you followed that. There isn't a student in this picture who didn't lose some member of their family. Jenin was just almost completely destroyed. And that's where we went, and that's where we studied the trap that is violence, how to break the cycle, what is nonviolence, how does it work, and is there any hope for it? And it was a wonderful experience with remarkable students. They were chosen from the senior level and the graduate level, mostly from the School of Education and the School of Social Work or Political Science. Some of them are political science. I was surprised, maybe you will be too, that on my right was the unquestionable leader of the group. And again, these are brilliant students. Orla is Muslim, obviously, Palestinian, from Hebron, actually. And she kept saying to me, oh, Dr. Levin, we have so much to unlearn. And that's sort of on my heart, too. Don't we all? We'll come back to that. I'm taking too much time. Maybe you remember who this is. I recognize who this is. And I end with this because I have a point. Richard Gere came to see the play that they had written, that they produced for him. They wanted him to critique it honestly. Does this communicate? Because this is who they are. Well, he couldn't see the stage the first go-round for weeping, all of us. But then he came back to the office with me, and we were talking about how to communicate with Americans, how to look at this, and to look at nonviolence and violence and our own situation. And he told me that he went home and he invited 300 people in Hollywood that he thought he could influence, and that they would tell the story too. At least we get some conversation going. He invited 300. Guess how many came? Do you see what we're up against? Thank you for listening and caring. God bless you.